inches away from the outstretched hands.
Number 6 for OC.
Sam Huff is there to intercept.
Samuels with a touchdown.
Just go out there and run like hell and catch it.
Touchdown, Money Jeweler. Intercepted Frank Larson.
If you can't get ready to play this game, you ought to take a hug.
One touchdown, we are world champions.
Believe.
Welcome to another edition of Giants Chronicles, presented by New York Presbyterian. I'm Bob Popp in the Legacy Club at MetLife Stadium. The Giants' history is loaded with Hall of Fame linebackers like Lawrence Taylor, Harry Carson, and Sam Huff. And they've had so many other great players like Carl Banks, Pepper Johnson, Jesse Armstead, Antonio Pierce. There was a player in the 1970s who was as good as all of them. His name, Brad Van Pelt. Drafted by the Giants in the second round in the 1973 draft, he was part of a team that was known for its defense, but struggled on the offensive side of the ball. He played his college ball at Michigan State, grew up in Michigan. It's a journey that takes a young man from the middle of America to the bright lights of the big city. From 1973 to 1983, Brad Van Pelt was one of the most talented and versatile players to ever don a Giants uniform. He possessed a rare combination of size, strength, and speed that made him both a dominant run stopper and an agile pass defender. He was a New York fan favorite who will always be admired for his unique athleticism. Born and raised in Owasso, Michigan, a small town 95 miles northwest of Detroit, Van Pelt is remembered as a local hero who never abandoned his Midwestern roots.
He's a small-town Michigan boy that just wanted to wear blue jeans. And even though he knew what it was like to be like, in the limelight in New York, it just wasn't Brad Van Pelt. My father wanted to be around his family. He wanted a simple life. He wanted to play golf with his brothers. He wanted to spend time with his mother. And Michigan was where he called home.
He was a good kid. I mean, never had any big problems with him at all. One of the first times I went to New York, he wanted me to follow him out to a car lot. So I did, and there was a neat, it was, I think, a Pontiac, beautiful, big ribbon on the top of it. It was for me, and he wanted me to see it. And he was always doing stuff like that.
I remember him always being humble, very humble man, caring, giving. It was never about himself. It was always about somebody else. It was never about Brad.
Best friend I've ever had. He was the best man in my wedding. I was the best man in his wedding. Just a regular old Joe.
Money meant nothing to him. He didn't care about that. Whatever, go out, he wasn't afraid to spend anything or give you anything or whatever. It was just, that's the way he was. He was very special.
Yeah, Brad just enjoyed people. In fact, he'd come home, from New York every off season. He couldn't wait to get home just to see the guys that, that he had grown up with. Played fast pitch softball, and we had a lot of fun with that.
We were on him.
But he was as happy with $5 in his pocket or $100. Didn't matter. Just he was around the guys, hanging out. After a ball game or whatever, that was what was important to him.
At Owasso High School, Brad was a three-sport star who earned all state honors in football, basketball, and baseball.
He was outstanding in football. We were down in one of our football games by 6 points. We had to go 80 yards, and believe it or not, he ran 3 quarterback sneaks and scored. And we ended up winning that game. In basketball, he was a rebounding machine in high school.
A good friend of mine, Dean Howe, was at the Flint Journal, got a phone call saying that this guy had 32 rebounds in a game. He said, yeah, sure. He didn't put it in the paper. But he said, I'm gonna go see that guy the next week. Brad had 42 rebounds in that game. Well, he was a spectacular pitcher. The Tigers tried to sign him out of high school. The St. Louis Cardinals desperately wanted him. But he was a football player at heart.
Growing up in Flint, as a kid, there was one name everybody looked up to, and it was Brad Van Pelt. He was like the Jim Thorpe of our community. I mean, he was just the guy who could do everything. Like I said, it was basketball, baseball, track, football. He did everything. There are a lot of athletes that came out of that era, but I don't think there was any as highly decorated as Brad, and you didn't hear a lot about it from him. But you heard a lot about it from all the people that just were effusive about how good he was.
He's a legend. There's nobody that I've ever talked to just like Brad Van Pelt.
People in this community love him and always will.
Stay tuned for more Giants Chronicles presented by New York Presbyterian. Brad Van Pelt. Welcome back to Giants Chronicles presented by New York Presbyterian. Brad Van Pelt. After an outstanding career at Owasso High School, where he was a three-sport star, Brad Van Pelt was off to Michigan State, where he would continue to put his athletic excellence on full display.
He was as good as anyone Michigan State's ever had. As an all-around athlete, 7 letters here, could have had more, could have played professional baseball, no question. And a lot of people thought he was as good a baseball prospect as a football player. That's saying something.
Brad compiled a 2.1 earned run average and 94 strikeouts in his 3 seasons on the mound for Michigan State. And Spartan fans will never forget the time he fanned future Hall of Famer Dave Winfield, who was an All-American at the University of Minnesota.
His biggest claim to fame in pitching was he struck out David Winfield. As far as pitching, as far as he was concerned, that's all he talked about.
On the basketball court, Brad was a standout because of his size and physicality.
He could have been a professional basketball player. He was a good, strong, physical basketball player.
There's a famous game in Jennison Fieldhouse against Indiana, and a great NBA player named George McGinnis.
The great George McGinnis, who was one of the top basketball players in the world. George McGinnis comes into East Lansing, and there's a big article in the paper about bad George McGinnis against mean Brad Van Pelt, and we were rooming together. And all of a sudden, Brad was gone, but their phone rings in their room, and I pick it up, and it's a guy says, "Hey, where's Brad Van Pelt?" And I said, "He's not here." He said, "Will you tell him that this is George McGinnis, and I'm going to kick his tail?" I said, "Yeah, George, I'll give him that message." He said, "You tell him I'm going to kick his tail tonight."
The first thing I remember is all of a sudden the entire football team marched in masse to watch this game.
Brad gets into the game and is guarding George McGinnis and does not just a credible job, does a very good job on George McGinnis.
He held McGinnis down lower than his scoring average. Eventually, the officials just stopped calling fouls. They said, it doesn't matter, they're going to beat each other up, let them go. And I think there's still a little bit of blood on the floor from that night.
But at heart, Van Pelt was a football player. A rare combination of size, strength, and speed with an unmatched set of skills.
We used to call him the perfect 10. He was just the kind of player, if God had created a football player, he would have looked like Brad Van Pelt. Some people said, my God, what does that guy play? And the answer is anywhere he wants. He was the kind of guy who could go sideline to sideline. He could make a tackle behind the line of scrimmage, and he could break up a pass 40 yards downfield. He was a spectacular defensive back, one of the biggest defensive backs ever. 2 interceptions for touchdowns in a game, had 14 interceptions as a collegiate player.
Van Pelt also played on special teams and was a dangerous threat as a punt returner. He was a 2-time consensus All-American. In 1972, he became the first and only defensive back to ever win the Maxwell Award.
I don't think a lot of people really understood what that award meant because defensive players didn't win it. And Michigan State hadn't had the season where Brad would be talked about for the Heisman, but it was recognition. He also won the Columbus Touchdown Club Defensive Player of the Year award.
In 2008, Michigan State University opened the Demmer Family Hall of History. It's a sports museum that honors the greatest players in Spartan football history. And throughout this hallowed hall, Brad Van Pelt's illustrious career is on display for all to see.
It's outstanding, the respect that Michigan State has granted my father, looking at all the times that he shows up. and the trophies he's won, just the youthfulness of him. I mean, it's amazing to see. It really puts a smile to my face. As you walk, through this Hall of Fame, my dad playing 3 sports during, his tenure here was a special time. It really reminds me not only of how great of an athlete my father was, but really what kind of man he was and where he was from. It's special.
Stay tuned for more Giants Chronicles presented by New York Presbyterian. Brad Van Pelt. Welcome back to Giants Chronicles, presented by New York Presbyterian. Brad Van Pelt. In 1973, the New York Giants did not have a first-round pick in the NFL Draft. So they selected Brad Van Pelt with their first pick in the second round.
There was an uncertainty whether he was going to play baseball or not. So we drafted him, and I think we got a little lucky there that he decided to come and play for us, not a baseball team.
In his rookie season, Van Pelt would have to adjust to not only the spotlight of playing in New York, but also to the challenge of playing a new position.
He played safety in college, and they brought him in as a linebacker. And the first year, I don't know if you know this, but Brad had struggled his first year really hard. He just couldn't get the concept of playing linebacker, being a safety, 10, 15 yards back. He just couldn't, being on the line of scrimmage, it took him a while to get that. So a guy named Marty Schottenheimer came into to be our defensive coach and our linebacker coach. And Marty Schottenheimer, as anybody knows, in the NFL was a great coach and stuff. He completely changed Brad. And what he did with Brad was, Brad was tall. He was 6'5", kind of lanky, and he had trouble with people getting at his feet, when the running backs would come out and stuff like that. So Marty, he decided to put him over the tight end. And once he got over that tight end, he was head up with the tight end, and the tight end was the same level as he just could do anything with that tight end. His legs were huge, and he just used them as power, and he would just stand the tight ends up. And the tight ends were helpless. As far as against the run, he just throw the tight end anywhere. He had that kind of strength with his legs and stuff. That was what made him great over the tight ends.
Under Schottenheimer's tutelage, Van Pelt began to shine. And in 1976, he was named to the Pro Bowl.
When I first met him, I thought to myself, wow, he's a big linebacker wearing number 10, and all of a sudden, I'm in this environment where I'm on the same team as this guy. You could see his athleticism on the football field. He was a big guy who had speed, quickness. He could take on the blockers, shed blockers, make tackles. He was just a natural-born athlete. Being around Brad Van Pelt, it helped me to become more of a linebacker than the defensive lineman that I was, in college and high school.
Van Pelt's athleticism and years of experience as a safety also made him a feared weapon on the Big Blue pass defense.
He was a great pass coverage guy, and it came from being a safety, and watching the patterns develop and stuff. He was able to pick that up pretty quick. What he picked up quicker than I thought he would as rushing the passer. He had quite a few sacks people don't know about, because especially when we went to the 34, LT was on. Everybody heard about LT, but Brad was doing a pretty dang good job of getting sacks himself.
The NFL did not start keeping track of sacks as an official statistic until 1982. But Van Pelt is credited with 24.5 sacks over the course of his career. Van Pelt was again named to the Pro Bowl in 1977, 78, 79, and 1980. And he had established the reputation as a relentless, hard-nosed defender.
He was tough as nails. This guy played hurt a lot of time.
But he played so hard, and he bled every game. That's the one thing that amazed me about Brad. He'd always be bleeding, but what a great performer.
Stay tuned for more Giants Chronicles presented by New York Presbyterian. Brad Van Pelt. Welcome back to Giants Chronicles presented by New York Presbyterian. Brad Van Pelt. In 1980, Van Pelt was selected to play in the Pro Bowl for a 5th consecutive year. even though the Giants team posted their 8th straight losing season with a 4-12 record.
He was a naturally gifted athlete. He was really the most talented player we had, and he played at a very high level on a not a very good team for quite a long time.
But in 1981, New York went 9-7 and made the playoffs for the first time in 18 years.
When we started winning in '81, that was probably the best thing that ever could happen to Brad. That's what he wanted, to win. He wasn't worried about making all pro or anything. He just wanted to play football and he wanted to win.
1981 also marked the year that the Giants added future Hall of Famer Lawrence Taylor to their already outstanding group of linebackers. And he and Van Pelt quickly earned each other's respect.
Brad Van Pelt, the things he taught me, and along with Brian Kelly and Harry Carson, I mean, God, the things they taught me, we made each other better, just made each other better.
The famous foursome of linebackers went on to become the best in the NFL and earned an equally famous nickname.
Brad, Brian, Lawrence, and myself, you know, we were the crunch bunch, and we were big, strong, fast, and we were able to get after people. Lawrence was on one side, Brad was on the other side, Brian was next to me, and you just felt like you could just smack people around. I'd never been a part of a group that demanded so much respect than that group, especially those linebackers.
He loved it, you know, he loved it. Just was a great bond between the four of us.
But over the next 2 years, the Giants posted back-to-back losing records. And Van Pelt felt that it might be time for him to move on.
'83, we had a terrible season, I think 3-13, and he just didn't see it going anywhere, and that's why he went to Bill and asked to be traded, because he wanted to win so bad.
Back in his time, you had to ask for a trade, and my dad did so. My dad loved the Giants. He loved being a Giant, and I think one of his biggest regrets was leaving the Giants.
Van Pelt spent the next 2 seasons with the Oakland Raiders and finished his NFL career as a member of the Cleveland Browns. Following his retirement in 1986, he returned to his home state. He finished his degree at Michigan State University and then moved a few miles north to the town of Harrison, where he could live close to his family. But in 2009, Brad Van Pelt passed away suddenly and unexpectedly at the age of 57.
You just got to deal with it, unfortunately, you know, and we lost him too early. He was a great person. People don't realize this guy would do anything in the world for you. He was, and he was such a family man. I mean, he was all about family.
His accomplishments, his accolades, who he was as a football player, wasn't that interesting. He was dad. You know, we wanted to go out there and, you know, said throw the baseball. We wanted to go to the beach. But when we got to be a teenager, that's when some of the films surfaced. That's when you started watching him, and you kind of started understanding, you know, what he did, how he played, and how good he was.
Van Pelt was named the New York Giants Player of the Decade for the 1970s. And in 2011, he was inducted into the New York Giants Ring of Honor.
And representing their dad is Brett, Bradley, and Brian Wellington Van Pelt.
Brad is a player who was naturally gifted, and he really should be mentioned for the Hall of Fame at some point.
He's in every Hall of Fame except for the NFL Hall of Fame, and he probably should be there.
Brad Van Pelt will be remembered as one of the Giants' all-time greatest players. But to those who knew him best, he was that and so much more.
He was just a sweetheart of a guy, and he just had a great personality. Just to see this guy, you know, he was like an Adonis, you know, his build, his looks, everything. He had everything going for him and stuff. He was just a good person.
My dad loved him. I don't know what it was, but they just kind of gravitated to each other. He was a big, tall, blonde-head kid, so maybe he thought he was one of his 12th child or something, I don't know. but there was a lot of just respect both ways.
He was sort of like a big teddy bear. Brad was a lovable guy that everybody loved, and, you know, he's a great friend, and he's like a brother.
constantly pulling something on somebody. Nothing serious, just wanting to have some fun, you know, keep things lively.
When we played board games and stuff,
He'd cheat.
that's right. That's what I was going to say. Anything to win, anything to win. So he would, whether it was a card game or a board game, if you weren't looking, you paid the price.
He wasn't intimidating. You know, he was someone that was very open, receptive. I don't think he ever thought of himself above someone else, whether they were on the streets in New York or on the playing field. He was an Owasso boy that never lost his sight of where he was from. And so, you know, Brad Van Pelt was always kept in high esteem because of the person he was.
Before there was the Big Blue Wrecking Crew, there was the Crunch Bunch, and Brad Van Pelt was front and center of that group. And of course, if you grew up in the 70s like me, you had a number 10 jersey, not for Eli Manning, but for Brad Van Pelt. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Giants Chronicles presented by New York Presbyterian. I'm Bob Pop in the Legacy Club at MetLife Stadium. This segment is brought to you by Geico. 15 minutes could save you 15% or more on your car insurance. Visit geico.com.